In street throwing, the only person you're competing with is yourself and the person you might have to use your skills against for real. Trophies don't matter. But naturally, some people have an urge to compare themselves to other throwers. Sometimes they find out about accuracy contests and other styles of throwing and want to use no-spin throwing for something like that. But while there is some overlap between the no-spin community and the stage performance style knife throwing community, comparisons aren't fair to them and aren't fair to us. It's two different things entirely. About the only thing they have in common is that they both go by the name knife throwing. In the modern world, we all love our games, gadgets, and gimmicks, but we try to stay away from all that in street throwing. Street throwing is not like organized sports where they coach you to do the same thing over and over. We don't have that luxury because nothing is predictable in the real world. The whole mindset of a game or a contest limits us because contests have rules that place arbitrary limits on what you can do, and there are no rules in what we're doing. These stage performances and contests takes place under artificial conditions with very soft targets, set distances, and knives that are usually very specialized for the contests. The scores they generate have nothing to do with the style of throwing we do because we train using real weapons, throw from different distances, and under much tougher circumstances. Now, obviously, accuracy is very important, but you will become more accurate simply through repetition. If you can hit a bullseye every time, that's a great thing, but the reason we don't emphasize the use of bullseye targets is because when you're trying to hit a bullseye, you aim. And when you aim, you do three things, and all of them are very bad from a street perspective. One, you hesitate just a little. We can't do that in self-defense throwing. Second, when you aim, you tend to take a little power off the throw, and again, that's the opposite of what we want in street throwing. Third, you tend to focus like a laser on the spot you're trying to hit, and that's a really good way to fail to hit a moving target or to fail to notice what else might be going on around you. With that said, there are good ways to informally test accuracy without the use of bullseye targets. One is to simply group knives into as small an area as you can. You will find that you have to get more and more accurate to miss the knives you've already thrown. Another technique is to simply line weapons up vertically on a board like a ladder, so you practice hitting at different heights. Sometimes beginners don't realize that when you do this, you'll make it easier if you start low when throwing overhand and work your way up the ladder. If you start high, you'll find that the first knife you stick is much more in the way. Of course, you reverse this if you're throwing underhand, or start at the far end of a more horizontal line if you're throwing sidearm. All beginners find that at some point they hit a wall. For most people, it's about 10 or 12 feet, where they cannot hit from any further back. They see old hands at no-spin throwing hitting throws from 20, 30 feet, even further away, and want to know how to do it. 3 or 4 of the 7 types of throwers, particularly compact throwers, are effective street throwers in the style that comes natural to them. And for that matter, even these stage performance throwers rarely throw from any further back than 9 or 10 feet. The question is, since street throws are from close range, do you want to invest the time to get better and better from close range, or do you want to get better from further back? Well, in fact, this is something of a false dichotomy because you're improving your close range skills by learning to throw from further back. We don't try to throw from 25 or 30 feet because it's useful in itself. From a street perspective, it isn't very useful at all, but because it's a great way to increase our skill level from the range that does matter. And even more importantly, since safety is our #1 priority, is that we want to practice from as far back as possible so we won't be getting hit with bounce backs. I don't like to hit beginners with too many technical details because no-spin throwing is not a formula. It has to be natural. Everything has to have a flow because every element affects every other element on any throw. If you overanalyze, you'll get paralysis from analysis. But when you're comfortable with basic throwing, you can start to think about these technical things. Not even counting what we're doing with the rest of our body, just with our arm motion, there are 4 joints involved in throwing: fingers, wrist, elbow, and shoulder. Each of these can be either flexible or locked to some degree. In addition to this, we have our stance, how we shift our weight from one leg to another, how we turn our hips or torso to generate power on a throw, and so on. And there are 4 main variables in the type of throw: range, size of weapon, balance point of weapon, and arm angle. And on top of this, we have the timing of the release of the throw. This all sounds very complicated because obviously the different ways we can mix and match all these different elements quickly becomes enormous. But in reality, it isn't that complicated because only a few things are the real difference makers. For one thing, unless we are artificially constrained, we don't really ever lock our shoulder unless we're throwing from extreme close range, nor do we totally freeze our finger motion, so we can eliminate worrying about those things. We don't want to get into a fine level of finger dexterity with throwing because you're going to lose that finger action in a panic situation. You don't want to depend on it. The tip for what you do with your fingers is to do as little as possible. Sometimes you need to add a little finger action, finger flip, but it's not common and not what we want to depend on. We also don't have to worry much about foot position, stance, torso turn, and so on in street throwing because those are things that really only have a large effect on long range throwing, so for now we can ignore all that. Now, regarding variables in the throw itself, if you think about it, the size of the weapon and the range at which you are throwing are really the same issue. Throwing a smaller weapon is the same thing as throwing from a longer range because what matters is that the weapon has to cover some multiple of its own length. In other words, throwing a 6-inch weapon 10 feet is really the same flight pattern, the same set of adjustments as throwing a 12-inch weapon 20 feet. So the real difference makers in the basic mechanics of throwing are 1, what you do with your elbow, 2, what you do with your wrist, and 3, how and when you release the weapon. Those 3 things, elbow locked or unlocked, wrist locked or flexible, and either releasing as you flip the wrist or before you flip the wrist forward, are the 3 interrelated elements of basic throwing. We do different things with each of these from different ranges or with different weapons. We can divide our basic throws into 3 categories: wrist throws, elbow throws, and shoulder throws. You can use any of these 3 joints as the main pivot or power generator. The rule is that if you're generating power with one of these, you'll have to more or less stiffen or lock up the other 2 joints to compensate, or you'll cause the weapon to over-rotate. And what you'll find is that what works from closer range won't work as well from longer range. What works with larger weapons won't work as well with smaller weapons, and vice versa. And what works from one angle won't work as well from another. Remember the basic theory of the no-spin flight pattern, a half circle where we begin pointed at 9 o'clock, release at 12 o'clock, and then the weapon flies a more elongated quarter turn on its own and sticks at 3 o'clock. The range we can throw is determined by the length of that original quarter arc we make before we release, the 9 o'clock to 12 o'clock. If you throw with the wrist as the pivot, you have a very small arc, the size of your hand, so very limited range. If you throw with the elbow as a pivot, the arc is the forearm plus the hand. If the shoulder is the pivot, the arc is much larger. It's the length of your whole arm and hand, plus the shoulder is the strongest group of muscles, so you get maximum possible power and range. So we use a different arc from different distances. Let's begin with a wrist throw used from close range. Of course, there are no exact lines between wrist, elbow, and shoulder throws. They gradually blend together. In reality, rarely will you use only the wrist. It's used in some combination with the elbow to generate momentum. You'll use a lot of wrist action when using a knife throwing grip from close range, and a combination of wrist and thumb snap when using a street grip. The whole definition of a wrist throw is whether or not you are releasing as you flip the wrist or before you flip the wrist forward. If you release as the wrist flips forward, you're using a wrist throw to some degree. If we release before the wrist flips or the elbow snaps or thumb or finger snaps, then you're not using a wrist throw but more of a sudden or frozen release, and you have to be using the elbow or shoulder for energy to propel the weapon. The great advantage of wrist-based throws is the ability to quickly generate powerful throws that come from virtually any angle. The disadvantage is that the wrist-powered throws have limited range because they tend to put a little rotation on the weapon and don't generate as much speed as the other throws. Next is the elbow throw used from intermediate range. This is much like the first throw we learned, just swinging our elbow and letting the weapon slide out and drop to the ground or into a target. The trick now is to be able to move our arm more quickly to generate more speed. This is the elbow chopping motion that comes naturally to some people. Of course, it's rarely going to be a pure elbow throw, but more a combination of elbow with some shoulder action as you move further back and wrist as you get closer. The variable is the release. If you use a locked wrist type of throw, which again means you have to release before you snap your wrist forward, or else not snap your wrist at all, you're using all elbow or shoulder to give your arm momentum to transfer to the weapon so it will fly. Now for the shoulder throw, used from outside hand-to-hand range. Again, all throwers hit a wall at about 10, 12, or 14 feet where they're unable to stick weapons. The reason this happens is that you have to transition from using the wrist or elbow action as propulsion, which is what works at close range, to using the shoulder to increase arm speed while keeping the wrist and elbow action out of the throw. You actually use less wrist flip or less elbow chop as you go further and further back. Beginners who are used to getting results from elbow and wrist action up close move back and can't do that to get sticks. So naturally they try to compensate and get more power from further back by flicking the wrist harder or by chopping their forearm even harder, which is the exact opposite of what they need to do. That, by the way, is one reason why beginners will stick in streaks and then suddenly lose the ability to stick anything. They master the art of crawling, then they start trying to run before they can even walk and lose what they've gained. From very long range, the arm has to stay more stiff in the other joints, but more powerful in the shoulder action, and the release has to be more frozen. This doesn't mean your wrist and elbow are totally frozen. It more means that your whole arm turns into a whip, and the whip is being swung by your shoulder. You want a straight but relaxed and flexible arm, not a stiff arm. Or you might say that you're using your shoulder to throw your arm like a sling, and at the end of your arm action, you let the weapon fly out naturally. If you time this right, it will straighten up in the flight pattern and fly like an arrow at the target. It's pretty amazing how far a knife will fly straight if this is done just right. The other thing that changes is the release, both in the timing and the technique. As we get further back, we are more and more using a sudden throw your hand open release. And the release point has to get earlier as the throw gets longer because you have to use more of a high lob flat pattern. Even from long range, it goes back to what we originally learned, to use the force of gravity and the momentum of the weapon created by our arm action to move the point of a weapon for us so it will drop into the target. From extreme long range, stance really starts to matter. Knives are less aerodynamic than spikes, so if you're talking about throws beyond about 40 feet, you're going to be limited to shuriken throwing or else using half spins or other spin techniques. And all that's outside the domain of street throwing. From inside about 35 or 40 feet, it's possible to throw a knife no spin, and that does overlap with street throwing, in theory at least. For extreme long range no spin throwing, you have to generate more power than you can get with the arm alone, so you have to become much more of a technical thrower. You really go beyond even being an arm thrower and become more of a whole body thrower. Good beginning stance with the lead foot forward and the shoulder square to the target is vital. From this position, you get body power just like a person throwing a ball would. You dip your lead knee a little, turn your torso by moving your hips quickly. You can cheat and shorten the distance to the target by leaning forwards as you throw, and this will also give you better mechanics for extreme long-range throwing, but make sure you're far enough back to lessen the chance of getting hit in the face in the event the weapon bounces back at you. Keep your feet a comfortable distance apart, not too close or too far to maintain better balance.